Berlin, 1919. The capital of a defeated empire smelled of coal dust and damp bricks. The old streets echoed with the clatter of trams, the murmurs of war widows, and the slow rebirth of a country unsure of its future. Amid this uneasy calm was born a boy who would one day be both admired and mourned, Hans-Joachim Marseille. His father, Siegfried Marseille, was an officer of the Imperial Army, a man who believed in order, iron discipline, and the dignity of silence. His mother, Charlotte, was his opposite, warm, lively, and musical. Between them the child grew restless, torn between the demand for control and the hunger for freedom. At home everything had its place, polished boots by the door, folded uniforms in the closet. Yet young Hans never stood still long enough to fit inside those lines. He loved movement. He climbed trees, raced bicycles through traffic, and once leapt from a rooftop with an umbrella to test whether falling could feel like flying. The umbrella didn't survive, but Hans did, laughing through a scraped knee and a scolding from his father. Even then the air fascinated him. He drew airplanes on the backs of his schoolbooks and talked about clouds as if they were maps. At school he was a paradox. His teachers wrote of a boy who could absorb information instantly, yet ignored every rule. He was charming, intelligent, and hopelessly undisciplined. He mocked authority with a grin that no reprimand could erase. The principal once told his parents Hans could become anything if only he could stand still long enough to finish something. The divorce of his parents when he was still a teenager left a mark deeper than any punishment. His father's distance hardened him, while his mother's affection turned him inward. He learned to hide behind humour, to laugh instead of argue. But the restlessness grew. The world outside seemed too small. Germany was changing, recovering from the humiliation of Versailles, rebuilding its pride through youth movements and the promise of modernity. For a boy who craved meaning and speed, the skies were irresistible. At 17, he applied to the Luftwaffe, a new secretive force born from the ashes of forbidden rearmament. The recruiters were impressed by his reflexes and his near-perfect eyesight. Yet even during basic training the same contradiction reappeared. He was brilliant in the air and impossible on the ground. His instructors described him as a gifted but incorrigible cadet. He ignored curfews, made jokes during briefings, and once borrowed a training aircraft without permission to see how it feels above the clouds. When he landed, perfectly of course, he was arrested for insubordination, then quietly praised for his daring. To most officers, Hans-Joachim was a headache. To a few, he was a revelation. One flight instructor, Captain Steinhoff, saw something rare, a natural pilot whose body and mind fused with the machine. "He doesn't fly the aeroplane," Steinhoff wrote. "He dances with it." Marseille treated flying like jazz: rhythm, timing, improvisation. He refused to rely on manuals. "Rules can't teach you wind," he once said. In the cockpit, he was calm, instinctive, alive in a way he never was on the ground. But that same brilliance had a cost. Discipline bored him. Formations felt like cages. Commanding officers demanded precision. Hans gave them poetry. When the war broke out in 1939, the Luftwaffe needed pilots faster than it could train them. Marseille received his wings and was assigned to Jagdgeschwader 52, the same unit that produced future legends. He was barely 20, quick to smile, quicker to test limits. Fellow pilots remembered his laughter in the mess hall, the way he hummed swing tunes before takeoff, and his habit of winking at mechanics before climbing into his aircraft, as if every mission were a show. In those first months, nobody, not even Hans himself, understood what kind of pilot he was about to become. The arrogance that irritated his superiors, the grace that thrilled his peers, the effortless confidence behind the controls, all of it would soon meet the only teacher that never lied: combat. He was a boy chasing clouds. The war would make him a legend, and, inevitably, destroy him. When war came in September 1939, Hans-Joachim Marseille was 20 years old, a young man with the confidence of a veteran and the experience of a student. The Luftwaffe was at its zenith: new aircraft, new tactics, and a sense of invincibility that pulsed through every squadron. For Marseille, it was the beginning of a journey that would test the difference between skill and discipline, between instinct and obedience. He began his combat career over France and Britain, flying missions in the Messerschmitt Bf 109. On paper, he had everything: speed, agility, a perfect eye for distance. But the reality of air combat was chaos. The sky over the channel was crowded, and his confidence quickly collided with the discipline of war. He broke formation, chased kills too far, and ignored radio orders. More than once, he returned to base alone, his ammunition spent, his commander furious. His superiors labelled him brilliant but unreliable, the same words that had followed him since training. His first victories came almost by accident. A burst of gunfire, a flash of smoke, the enemy spiralling into the sea. But they did not bring joy. The sight of an aircraft breaking apart under his fire left him shaken. This was no longer the graceful sport he imagined. It was destruction, fast and personal. He began to drink more after missions, laughing louder than anyone else at the bar, trying to bury the silence that followed battle. After the Battle of Britain, his performance was deemed inconsistent. He was reassigned to Jagdgeschwader 27, a transfer some considered a quiet demotion. Yet fate had a strange sense of direction. In 1941, his new unit was deployed to North Africa, a place that would redefine him completely. The first time Marseille saw the desert, he thought it looked like an ocean turned to gold. There were no trees, no cities, no smoke, only space and light. Here, combat was stripped to its essence, pilot against pilot, skill against gravity. The heat shimmered through the air, distorting distance, forcing him to rely on instinct rather than instruments. He thrived in it. "You can't hide in the desert," he once said. "It makes you honest." The new environment unlocked something inside him. He studied the British and South African pilots he fought against, learned their manoeuvres, anticipated their rhythm. He discovered that most men fired too late, waiting until the enemy filled their sights. Marseille calculated differently. He shot into the future, predicting where the target would be, not where it was. It required nerve and precision, and it worked. By the spring of 1942, his transformation was undeniable. He had grown lean, focused, patient. The impulsive showman of France had become a craftsman of combat. His squadron mates watched him perform impossible attacks, quick dives, short bursts, never wasting a bullet. He could down multiple aircraft in a single sortie, often returning with barely a scratch. But even as his legend grew, he refused to act like a hero. Between missions, he played jazz records on a portable gramophone, danced in the sand with mechanics, and treated war as if it were temporary. "When I fly," he told one reporter, "it's not for the Führer or the Reich. It's because flying makes sense when nothing else does." In the still heat of the African afternoon, his aircraft, marked with the number 14, became a familiar shape in the endless blue. He flew it not like a soldier, but like an artist, painting fleeting patterns in air and light. Each victory made his commanders take notice. For the first time, they stopped trying to discipline him. They simply cleared the sky and let him work. By the end of 1941, the once undisciplined cadet from Berlin had become one of the most feared and respected pilots in the desert. Among his peers, a new name began to circulate, spoken half in awe, half in disbelief. Der Stern von Afrika, the Star of Africa. By the summer of 1942, the desert was his stage. Over the sands of North Africa, where heat shimmered above the dunes and the horizon trembled like liquid glass, Hans-Joachim Marseille reigned. The men of Jagdgeschwader 27 called him Der Stern von Afrika, the Star of Africa. His enemies, British and South African pilots, spoke his name with wary respect. He was 22, restless, unpredictable, and at the height of his brilliance. From dawn until dusk, the war played out under a pale, merciless sun. The airfields near El Alamein were nothing more than strips of sand lined with canvas tents and fuel drums half buried in dust. Mechanics worked with rags tied across their faces, engines growled, and somewhere above it all, Marseille's Messerschmitt Bf 109F4 carved its bright path through the sky. He flew with a fluidity that seemed impossible in a machine of metal and fuel. Every manoeuvre, every burst of gunfire had rhythm, not rage. He didn't chase kills, he hunted geometry. Marseille's method was unlike any other pilot's. He rarely fired head-on. Instead, he attacked from the sun, curving across his target's path in a precise arc. His bursts lasted no longer than a heartbeat. He once told a new recruit, If you hear your gun longer than the sound of your breath, you're wasting ammunition. On good days, he landed with only a handful of bullets spent, and several victories to his name. By August, his numbers were staggering. Dozens of enemy aircraft fell to his aim. Even his superiors struggled to believe the reports. He was awarded the Knight's Cross with oak leaves and swords, and soon after the Diamonds, Germany's highest honour for a living pilot. But fame brought unease. Each ceremony felt hollow. He shook hands, smiled for photographs, then returned to the desert where the cameras could not follow. In camp, Marseille remained a contradiction. He played swing music on a battered gramophone, quoting American lyrics banned by the regime. He joked with mechanics, teased officers, and spoke of the enemy with respect rather than hatred. "They fly like we do," he once said, "and they die like we do." His humanity confused his commanders. They wanted a symbol, not a man. The strain of constant combat began to show. He slept little, often waking before dawn to check his aircraft himself. His closest friends had been killed, one after another, until only his mechanic and a few surviving pilots remained from the original group. He smiled less, one of them later remembered, but when he did, it felt like sunlight. Then came September 1st, 1942, the day that sealed his legend. The morning began with wind and dust storms sweeping the horizon. Visibility was poor, and yet the order came: intercept Allied bombers approaching from the northwest. Marseille led his flight into the turbulence, vanishing into haze. Within minutes, his calm voice crackled over the radio, counting kills as he dived and climbed through chaos. By evening, 17 Allied aircraft were confirmed destroyed, all by his hand. It was a feat no other German pilot would match. That night, celebrations erupted at base. Goering's telegram arrived, reporters clamoured for interviews, and champagne flowed from crates sent by headquarters. But Marseille stayed apart. Sitting outside his tent, he watched the sunset bleed across the dunes, its glow turning the sand into bronze. When a fellow pilot approached with congratulations, he answered softly, 17. That's 17 families waiting for someone who won't come home. Don't call that victory. The pressure of fame grew heavier. He was now a national hero, his face printed on magazines, his story used to inspire youth back in Germany. Yet he felt increasingly alien. He despised parades, refused propaganda tours, and dismissed any talk of ideology. "I fly for the sky," he said, "not for men who've never seen it." As the weeks passed, fatigue eroded him. His eyes were bloodshot from sand and smoke, his body grew thin, his voice quieter. Still, his flying remained flawless. The younger pilots idolized him, but they also saw the cost. He had become the embodiment of perfection, and its price. By late September, the heat began to fade. The desert winds carried a chill, and the war moved toward a new phase. Marseille's aircraft, Yellow 14, took off one evening for a patrol over the dying light. From below, the men watched him vanish into a violet sky streaked with gold. For a moment, his plane was only a glint against the sun, the star of Africa, shining above the endless sand. No one yet knew that within a month, that light would go out. By the autumn of 1942, Hans-Joachim Marseille was a legend living in slow collapse. His fame stretched across Europe, his name whispered in Allied camps and celebrated in German newspapers. Yet, in the desert itself, far from Berlin's applause, the man behind Der Stern von Afrika was growing quieter. He had achieved everything a pilot could: 158 confirmed victories, every medal his country could give, and yet he carried himself like someone already saying goodbye. Life at the base near El Alamein had changed. The mess hall, once full of laughter and music, now felt hollow. The friends who had shared his rise were gone, replaced by younger, wide-eyed pilots who treated him with awe and fear. They watched him carefully, studying every move, as if his gift could be learned. But Marseille no longer wanted disciples. He spoke little, ate little, and spent his evenings sitting beside his aircraft, watching the sunset fade into the dunes. When one of the newcomers asked how it felt to be invincible, he smiled faintly. "No one is invincible," he said. "We only borrow time." The strain of constant combat had begun to unravel him. He slept poorly, haunted by memories of fire and falling wrecks. Once, his mechanic found him awake at 3 in the morning, staring at the stars. "They look different when you know you've flown higher than them," Marseille murmured. He was still flying with precision and courage, but each mission felt heavier. Every victory deepened his exhaustion. Command wanted to pull him from the front. They urged him to rest, to return to Germany for propaganda tours and recruitment drives. Marseille refused. "You can't photograph the truth from behind a desk," he said. "My war is here." But his defiance no longer came from pride. It came from fear. He was afraid of stillness, afraid of reflection. In the air, he could lose himself in motion. On the ground, he was left alone with his ghosts. The first signs of decline appeared in small ways: a slower climb, a longer takeoff, a lapse in concentration during debriefings. His mechanics noticed that he checked his aircraft obsessively, as though sensing betrayal in its frame. He joked less, drank more coffee, and seemed unable to rest his hands. "He's burning the candle from both ends," one officer said, "and the flame is eating him alive." Then came the morning of September 30th, 1942. The desert air was cool, the horizon pale with dust. Marseille prepared for what should have been a routine ferry flight, transferring his aircraft, a Bf 109 G2, to another base deeper in Egypt. He seemed calm, even cheerful, joking lightly as he climbed into the cockpit. At 11:30 a.m., his formation took off. Minutes later, something went wrong. At 4,000 meters, his engine began to sputter, a mechanical failure, sudden and violent. Smoke filled the cockpit. Over the radio, his voice remained calm. "Engine trouble, I'm bailing out." His comrades saw the yellow aircraft slow, nose dipping gently as the canopy opened. Marseille climbed out, balancing on the fuselage, the wind tearing at his uniform. He pushed away from the plane, but the motion was off. Perhaps he struck the tail, perhaps the airflow caught him wrong. His parachute deployed late, tangled. From below, his comrades watched helplessly. For a few seconds, his figure spun through the empty air, the man who had ruled the sky now falling through it. The impact was final. No fire, no explosion, just a cloud of dust rising from the sand. They landed nearby, running across the dunes, shouting his name. He lay still, untouched by the violence that had claimed so many others. His face was calm, almost peaceful. The desert that had crowned him had taken him back without cruelty, without noise. When the news reached command, silence spread through the camp. Mechanics stopped their work. Pilots stood beside their aircraft, looking upward. "The Star of Africa has set," one officer said quietly. In Berlin, the announcement came days later. Another headline, another speech. But out in the desert, his men buried him at Derna, marking the grave with a propeller blade. As the wind swept across the dunes, it erased their footprints within hours. Only the sound of the sky remained, vast, indifferent, eternal. The miracle had ended as it began. A young man chasing the air, and the air, at last, refusing to let him go. The message came through the radio at noon. Marseille down, engine failure, no survivors. For a moment, no one in JG-27 spoke. The men at the airfield stood frozen, waiting for someone to correct it, a mistake, a misunderstanding, another rumour of death that would vanish with the next sortie. But the voice on the line did not return. The desert was silent. Hours later, a small patrol recovered his body. There were no burns, no torn uniform, just the stillness of a man who had spent his life moving faster than anyone else. His parachute was tangled beside him, white silk against the red sand. The mechanic who had worked on his aircraft knelt beside him and whispered, "You always said the sky would keep you." That evening, the men of JG-27 buried Hans-Joachim Marseille near Derna. The grave was shallow, dug into the hard earth by his comrades. They used a broken propeller blade as a marker and set his goggles atop it. The commander read a few words. He fought with honour. The desert was his home, and now it keeps him. No one spoke afterward. The sound of the wind was all that filled the space where applause might have been. For days, the camp moved like a body without a pulse. Mechanics worked slower. Pilots lingered before takeoff. The sky, once his playground, now seemed indifferent. a blank page without its brightest line. Younger flyers, who had idolized him, whispered his name as if afraid to speak it aloud. Even his enemies felt the absence. Across the front, Allied squadrons heard the news through intercepted transmissions. In one British mess tent, a pilot poured a drink and said quietly, "The Star of Africa is gone." A few days later, near El Alamein, a small reconnaissance flight dropped a wreath near German lines. Attached was a note written in English. "To the Star of Africa, a worthy opponent." It drifted to the ground, unseen by those who would have understood it best. Back in Germany, the story became something else entirely. Newspapers hailed him as the greatest fighter pilot of the Desert War. His photograph filled front pages. His smile, captured months earlier, was used to embody youth, courage, and sacrifice. Radio broadcasts spoke of his final mission, inventing details to make his death sound noble, inevitable, divine. The truth, that it was a mechanical failure, not a duel, was buried under slogans. Hermann Goering ordered a state funeral in Berlin, though the body never left Africa. The ceremony was held under marble arches, with banners, speeches, and military music. The Führer sent condolences to Marseille's mother, praising her son's heroic devotion to the Reich. To those who had known him, it felt obscene. They remembered a man who joked in American slang, who danced barefoot in the sand, who said he flew not for Germany, but for the feeling of flight itself. The myth was complete, and it no longer belonged to him. Among his comrades, the loss cut deeper than command would admit. They spoke of him quietly in the months that followed, describing how he seemed to know the end was near. One pilot recalled that a week before his death, Marseille had said, "When the sky stops answering, you'll know it's time to go." The words lingered like prophecy. The desert does not keep monuments for long. Within weeks, the wind erased the traces of the grave. Only the propeller blade remained, half buried, pointing toward the horizon. Travellers who passed by months later said it looked like a compass needle, still waiting to find true north. In the end, the war moved on, as wars always do. New aces replaced the fallen, new headlines replaced the old. But among those who had seen him fly, the memory endured. They said that in the brief moment between sunrise and heat, when the air turned gold, you could almost hear the faint hum of an engine, the echo of a young man who once ruled the desert sky. Hans-Joachim Marseille was 22 when he fell. The Star of Africa had burned too brightly to last. When the war ended, the desert kept its silence. The world that had once celebrated Hans-Joachim Marseille now lay in ruins. Germany was a nation divided, its heroes forgotten or condemned. The boy who had danced in the air over North Africa vanished into the footnotes of history, too famous to ignore, too inconvenient to remember. For years his name was spoken only in whispers. To the victors he was another instrument of the Luftwaffe, a cog in Hitler's machine. His brilliance in the cockpit was buried beneath guilt by association. The man who had never sworn blind loyalty to the Reich was remembered as one of its symbols. The myth survived, but the truth, the human being behind the medals, disappeared. In the 1950s, as Germany rebuilt, a new generation began to rediscover him. Aviation historians looked back at combat reports and found something extraordinary: precision beyond training, intuition that bordered on art. His logbooks and flight analyses revealed a pilot who could calculate lead and distance faster than a gun sight, a natural mathematician who saw combat as motion and rhythm rather than chance. American and British researchers studying air combat tactics cited him as a pioneer of deflection shooting, a technique still taught in pilot schools long after his death. Yet his story was never just about numbers. Those who served with him described a man of contradictions, confident and shy, rebellious yet deeply loyal to those he trusted. He played forbidden jazz records, befriended captured Allied pilots, and refused to let hatred guide his hand. He fought his battles in the air, one veteran said, but he never brought them down to earth. For some, that made him dangerous, too independent, too human in a world that demanded obedience. For others, it made him timeless. Decades later, Luftwaffe veterans and Allied pilots who had once fought each other stood side by side at memorials, acknowledging the strange fraternity of men who had shared the same sky. They spoke of Marseille with the respect reserved for those who had mastered their craft, not as a nationalist icon, but as a flyer who had touched the limits of what a human could do in flight. The myth of the Star of Africa remains complicated. His 158 victories are still debated, some confirmed, others doubted. Historians argue over figures, over ideology, over what it means to celebrate skill born of war. But beyond the arguments lies something simpler. The image of a young man who loved flying more than victory, who found freedom not in conquest but in movement. His grave in Libya is gone now, claimed by the wind and the years. Only a small memorial stands in his hometown of Berlin-Charlottenburg. A plaque, modest and clean, with his name, rank, and the years 1919 to 1942. People pass by without noticing. The city that raised him has long forgotten the boy who tried to race the sky. And yet, among pilots his legacy endures. Study his maneuvers, his control, his calm. In every tight turn, in every precise shot, there's a trace of his hand, the echo of a rhythm that began over the sands of North Africa. The desert, once filled with the thunder of his engine, is quiet now. But when the wind rises and the sunlight burns white across the dunes, some swear it sounds like the hum of a Messerschmitt passing overhead, a ghost tracing the horizon, forever chasing the perfect line. He was 22 when he fell, too young to grow old, too brilliant to fade quietly. Hans-Joachim Marseille remains what he always was, not a soldier of empire, but a child of the air. And like all who loved the sky too much, he belonged to it in the end.